Ceri Davies, Sir John Curtice, Sara Hobolt, and perhaps for the discussion at the end, James Tilley to present at this seminar. And we're going to kick off with Ceri. So do you want to take it away?
I'm very happy to. Not to contradict you, Dan, but I was hoping that Sara might go first.
Sorry. Sorry. Yes, Sara.
We've got something interesting to say in response.
Yes. No. Absolutely, Sara. So sorry. Sorry. Distracted for a moment now.
That's all fine. Thank you so much, Dan, for organizing this and for inviting us here. And I'm delighted to be in such great company. And we really, as you'll see, the talk here, which is based on work by James Tilley and I. James Tilley, professor at the University of Oxford, really links very nicely with what you'll see by Ceri and John afterwards, because it's about Brexit identity. And let me share with you some of that research that we've done thanks to the UK in a changing Europe and the ESRC. We've been able to look at and track the development in Brexit identities. Because, of course, one of the major things, and perhaps in some ways a bit unexpected, that came out of the referendum was that the people became and were very divided, not just divided on the issue of Brexit, but also that division became something more than simply a policy disagreement. It became part of who we were. We started to think of ourselves as Remainers or as Leavers or as Brexiteers. And this is what James and I have studied, and also what John Curtice has studied in some of his work, namely this emergence of new political identities. It wasn't that people didn't have attitudes towards Europe before, but really a social identity is something more than simply a policy attitude. It is an in-group feeling that identifies and shapes who you think you are, and also how you look at the world and how you look at the outgroup, the other. So if you're a Remainer, you would look in a certain way at Leavers and vice versa. And what happened with the Brexit referendum, that it acted as a sort of trigger of perhaps divisions that in some ways were already there in the British society, British politics, but had not crystallized in the form of these types of identities before the referendum. And part of the reason for that was that the campaign and the aftermath of the campaign vastly increased the saliency of this issue of being in or outside the European Union. But also that the vote itself compelled people to take a side, to be either for or against, and taking on the labels that happened to be on the ballot paper, namely to be remaining, to be a Remainer in the EU, or to be a Leaver in favor of leaving the EU. And what was fascinating with these Brexit identities that emerged is that they cut across existing partisan identities. There were Leavers within the Labour Party, and there were Remainers within the Conservative Party, and the same with the other parties. But more importantly, and this is something that John Curtice has also shown in his work, that in fact they became more strongly held than partisan identities. So people felt more strongly about being a Leaver or Remainer than they did about being a Labour supporter or Conservative. What it did it was more than just an in-group feeling. It also created something which academics like to refer to as affective polarization. Now, affective polarization is not only that sense of an in-group identity, but also a hostility, animosity towards the outgroup. And that spilled over beyond politics into how we looked at each other in society. And at the time, and still today, as you'll see with some of the data I'll show you, a majority of people did identify as Remainers or Leavers. And here's just a summary of some of the data with two different questions, one from the British election study, which concerns closeness to the Leave or Remain group, and another which is the identity question that we adopted, which is similar to the partisan identity question in terms of, do you think of yourself as a Leaver or Remainer or neither? And in either case, you can see that more than 70%, so between 70 and 85% of the population did think of themselves in either of those camps. And also it was quite evenly split, or indeed almost exactly evenly split, a bit like the referendum, between Leavers and Remainers. We have also looked at in our work, not just that in-group feeling, but also the out-group animosity, that out-group hostility. And here's a question that's often used in social psychology. How do we describe our in-group and an out-group? With a set of sort of standard questions from social psychology, do you describe people as hypocritical, selfish, close-minded? And we can see that we tend to think of, leavers would tend to think of remainers as hypocritical, selfish, and close-minded, whereas they would think of other leavers as honest, intelligent, and open-minded. And in fact, it's the exact mirror image when you then ask remainers. They would think of themselves as their own in-group as honest, intelligent, and open-minded, and leavers as hypocritical, selfish, and close-minded. And in fact, if anything, remainers might have been slightly more prejudiced, perhaps because they were on the losing side. And so really that shows how these identities are more than just a policy disagreement, but also shapes how we see each other. Now, the question we're looking at now in our research is where are we now in this question of this Brexit division and these Brexit identities? Do they still matter? A lot has happened since that Brexit referendum in 2016, not least the fact that we have now left the European Union. What does it even mean to be a Remainer now that we are outside the European Union? What does it mean to be a leaver now that we have left? And just two headlines from the Sun front pages to show what else has happened since this glorious Independence Day, according to the Sun, where Britain left the European Union. Of course, we've had the pandemic, and the pandemic really overshadowed any other political issue. And here, if we look at data from YouGov that asks about the most important issue facing the country today, and I've just highlighted the blue line there is people saying that Britain leaving the EU is the most important issue facing the country today. You can see that back prior to the pandemic and prior to us leaving the EU in mid 2019, it was around 70% of people who would say Brexit is the most important issue. Now, after both us leaving the EU and the pandemic, that is now closer to a quarter of people. So still, you might think quite high, but nothing to the extent that it was. You might ask, what are the issues that now dominate? Well, you won't be surprised to hear that it is the economy and it is health that are now seen as the most important issues facing Britain. But does that mean that these identities of being a leaver and remainer, that they are gone, that they no longer matter? And what we find in our tracker survey, these are all nationally representative polls that we conduct at regular intervals. And what we find is that, in fact, and perhaps surprisingly, these Brexit identities have remained remarkably stable. So it's still about 75% of people, or close to that, that identify as either a leaver or remainer. We have seen, as you can see here, a slight decline in terms of identification with those groups, especially amongst leavers, but it's still very prevalent amongst people to say they see themselves or think of themselves as leavers and remainers. Interestingly, with everything that's happened, it is also still very strongly held identity. So when we ask whether this identity is very or extremely important, you have 60% of leavers and 67% of remainers saying that this is very or extremely important to them. And that is compared to much weaker partisan identities. So these old classic partisanship identities are less strongly held than being a leaver or remainer. We can see only 34% of Conservatives and only 41% of Labour identifiers say that this is very or extremely important to them. Now, that means that when you have strongly held identities, that also shapes how you look at the world. We know that from partisan identities. And what we look at in our research is how your Brexit identities translate into how you view the economy, how you view political events, and so on. And here's just a broad brush questions about your pessimism and optimism about the effect of Brexit on Britain. And you can see that leavers are consistently very optimistic. That's the red line there. You can see there's almost no movement over the years, and they're very optimistic. Whereas remainers, they're below the zero line, which meaning they think that Brexit has on the whole had a very negative effect, are consistently very pessimistic. The people who didn't vote, those without an identity, are there slightly on the pessimistic side, but much less so than Remainers. And what's perhaps so noteworthy is that regardless of what's happening in the economy, in politics, this is so stable. And that does raise the question about whether or not it's really the identity channeling how we look at the world more than actually the information we receive. Identities also shape whether we think Brexit is to blame or indeed to credit for events that might happen. So recently we had a fuel crisis, as you recall, in the UK, and you will have seen striking results that showed that Remainers would consistently blame Brexit, whereas Leavers would think that other factors were at play. And we ask a question about whether leaving the EU has affected current economic conditions in Britain. And again, we see this big divide, whereas you see Remainers consistently saying this is on a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 means has not affected at all, and 10 means has affected a lot. And what we can see is that consistently Remainers and also increasingly think that Brexit has affected economic conditions in Britain a lot. We can see that Leavers much less so, although it's now slightly above 5, which suggests there is some attribution of responsibility to Brexit even amongst Leavers. That leaves the question of how does that align with existing political divisions in the UK? How might that come to matter in future elections? Is this a division that still divides parties the way it once did? And we have looked at the relationship between partisan identities and Leave Remain identities. And here we can see on the left is for Conservative identifiers, and on the right is for Labour identifiers. And we have looked at 2 time points here for simplicity. We've looked at 2017 and 2021 to look at whether or not there's been any development. And the key thing you can see is, of course, there are many more Leavers in the Conservative Party and many more Remainers in the Labour Party, not surprisingly. We can also see that in both parties, there's been a growth in people who are neither, so who don't identify. However, Remainers have remained quite stable within the Labour parties, where there's been a decline in the proportion of Leavers. So there is some kind of suggestion of a realignment where the Conservatives have over the years become a bit more of the party of Brexit, and Labour has become more of the party of Remainers. And that is even more stark when we look now here on the left for the Liberal Democrats. We can see there's very few Leave identifiers now within the Liberal Democrats, whereas the development on the right in the SNP is just that many more people within SNP who really don't identify as either. Perhaps another issue, maybe Scottish independence has become more important to SNP supporters than Leave and Remain. So just to summarize here, in terms of these years of research on this new emergent identity, what we've shown is that Brexit has really emerged as a powerful division, of course, politically, but also as a political identity in the UK. It's less salient now, less salient over the last few years, in part due to the pandemic, in part maybe also due to the fact that the UK has left the EU. But what we are seeing is that the country remains divided, and that those divisions, those identities shape how they interpret political and economic developments. And that means we continue to look very differently at any events that happen, depending on whether or not we are Leavers or Remainers. James and I are also looking at a number of other related projects in terms of how changing subsidy structures in Wales shape these attitudes and identities. What sort of individuals are those who are more likely to hold on to their identities, and what sort of people are more likely to leave them behind? And also, how do social networks in your family, on social media, and geographically, how do they reinforce or weaken Brexit identities? So those are just some of our other projects, but for now, I'll leave it at that. And I know that Ceri and John will share more insights about the effects of Brexit identities in their presentations. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, Sara. Can I just ask you one question before we move on to the next presentation? So you talked about effective polarization. how unusual is that kind of strength of polarization in British politics historically? And is it characteristic of politics in any other democracies?
So the term affective polarization has become very popularized in recent academic literature through what we've seen in the United States, to start with your second question. So of course, the most prominent example in the Western world we have of this affective polarization now is between Democrats and Republicans. And you really see in US politics how that spills over beyond ideological polarization, because it's something that's fundamentally different than just, of course, it's related to, but not the same as policy disagreement, because it's really about how we look at people around us and also people in the outgroup. And so, of course, it's not that it's never existed around partisan identities. So we have not run these similar surveys for the last 50 years. So in that sense, I can't give you an exact empirical answer to that. Perhaps James can. What?
I can.
So James will answer that one, but of course it's also something that we've seen in partisan politics, both in the UK and elsewhere. And then now James will tell us how it's developed over time.
Well, I mean, there were some early surveys in the 60s that have some questions that can relate to affective polarisation on a party level in Britain. It is quite difficult to actually map these over time, but I think one would probably say it's been either rather stable or maybe even declining in terms of partisan affective polarisation, which makes sense because a lot of the things that generate that are in people being within social groups and identifying with social groups. In the British case, it would be social class. So I think in terms of party terms, obviously we've seen kind of a rather static picture. And as Sara said in her presentation, Brexit identities, typically speaking, and even today, are held more strongly. They generate more out-group hostility and they generate more in-group love than party identities do. And I think just to pick up on one thing you asked there, Dan, about the magnitude of these effects, we can look at these kind of measures that we have and compare them to the United States and Democrats versus Republicans there. And actually, you might think that the US was more polarized in these terms, but it looks relatively similar to the kinds of measures we have of Brexit identities in Britain. I think not so much now, because things have kind of trickled down a little bit. But at the height, we actually found more effective polarization in Britain along Brexit lines than we did in the United States along partisan lines. Today, it's probably a little bit lower, though.
That's fascinating. Thank you. So now, if it's okay, we'll move on to the next presentation. And I'm a little bit anxious that I'm going to get the wrong person to start again, but I think Ceri is beginning. So thanks very much, Ceri.
That's great, thank you, Dan, and thanks to Sara for that. So just go through the. Sharing of screens, marvelous. Yes, so John and I wanted to share a little bit about a project we've been working on for the last couple of years, which I'll say just a bit more about in a second. And one of the things that we wanted to talk about and cover just now was a snapshot, really, of some of our findings, particularly as they relate to the ways in which deliberation may or may not have supported Remainers and Leavers in our project to kind of cut across some of the divides of polarisation and social identities that Sara has outlined in her presentation. So I'm going to be taking the first part of that by looking at some of the qualitative data that we've gleaned from the project, and then John is going to talk about the survey results. So just to put some of this in context before I tell you about it, this is the project that we're talking about, Future of Britain. So really the whole aim of the project was to explore using deliberative polling, public attitudes towards areas that prior to us leaving the EU had largely been within EU competences, including immigration, which is the focus of what we're talking about today. We ran two sections of fieldwork, two waves of fieldwork in 2019 and 2020, and these were deliberative polls that were held online with a total of about 376 participants who were drawn from the NatSem panel and whom, as well as coming together for a weekend's worth of deliberation and moving through impartial briefing documents, participating in moderated small group discussions and plenary sessions with experts on the topics that were under discussion, also completed a series of surveys, both in their recruitment, pre and post the deliberation, and then a follow-up some months later. So it's the results of that data set plus the coded transcripts of all of the discussions from those small groups that we've derived these findings from today. So what people deliberated on. So as I say, our focus today is principally on immigration, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the sort of content and character of the discussion that we think we've drawn from our analysis. And really people were deliberating on sets of policy choices available to the UK once it had left the EU. And of course, it's important to say that at the point people were deliberating, there wasn't much kind of concrete policy options on the table. So these were some of the choices that might be open to people. And on the topic of immigration, we were looking at three main areas, which you can see here. So we wanted to explore what the UK's priorities should be, what rights migrants should have once they entered the UK, and we also explored the question of whether there should be a cap on the level of migration, or at least some kind of target level in any one year. So this meant talking about things including rules on whether immigration should be the same respective of a migrant's country of origin, what sorts of occupational criteria migrants should have to satisfy, and what rules should apply to the admission of family members. We also discussed the issue of rights migrants would have, including when they should be able to claim welfare benefits, for example, or how easy or difficult it should be for a migrant to gain the right to live permanently in the UK. So the whole point of participants having access to impartial briefing materials and a panel of experts who represented various sides of the policy question debate meant that people were asked to weigh the pros and cons, ultimately, of many of the policy options that were under discussion. And so inevitably in our data, one of the things that's characterised it is that we have got discussions on both sides of the argument. So that's something that came up, and we could see that sometimes led to potential contradictions in some of the things that people thought and the analysis that we've derived. But in terms of the conversations people had with each other, and I think it's important to say, especially in the context of the conversation we're having today about leave and remain identities, is that the qualitative data as we've analysed it so far has been at the aggregate group level. So it's John's work on the survey data which is going to help us drill down and see more specifically where leavers and remainers might have sat on various issues, and indeed some of the questions, the attendant questions around polarisation. In terms of the discussions that groups had with each other, we found that in the content of their discussions, people really weighed two main considerations around the policy questions they were asked to think about. And these fell into moral and ethical arguments about the rights of immigrants and the support they should receive to integrate and contribute. And these were mostly used in defence of a more sort of liberal approach to certain policy questions. Concern was generally expressed within these argument making about the ethics of splitting up families, for example, or the dangers of only valuing migrants for their economic contribution, and of not recognising everybody's right to a good quality of life. And then on the other hand, we saw a strong emerging theme to do with arguments and considerations which were more related to ideas of self-interest, which tended to be more aligned with the tougher stance on immigration overall, and where the priority for people in any future policy option should be a benefit to Britain and protecting the economic interests of those living here. So these also tended, as you can imagine, to lay behind arguments for tighter control. So just wanted to share some examples of how these came up in the data. And so this is just an example of a sort of the moral ethical theme, which was on the topic of admission of spouses and families. So you can see here that there's a discussion ongoing about whether or people's objection to the fact that families shouldn't be split up. And it's important that in any future policy making, we should find a way to make sure that families are together. But these, some of these questions around sort of ethical issues or to do with how people might live when they're here, also related to issues to do with language and ensuring standards of living, access to community. So many of these were also themes which tended to kind of come up or be made within the context of arguments that had a sort of more moral or ethical flavour. And then on the other hand, you have questions of self-interest, which tended to tie very closely to themes around economic protectionism. So those arguing for a lower overall level of immigration thought that British people should have first priority for jobs and services, and often expressed the view that migrants put undue pressure on a welfare system which they thought was already stretched. And this sentiment was accompanied by a sense somehow that you can see in this first quote here that Britain was somehow limited in its size and geography, and that was an important factor, an important consideration driving this idea around a degree of economic protectionism. And what the second quote speaks a little bit more to, which we also saw quite clearly in the data, is this notion around self-reliance and the priority or the emphasis that should be put on migrants and their families needing to demonstrate some degree of self-reliance, both strongly with an economic bent, but also in terms of a larger kind of cultural and community context. So these things came through strongly. On the question of freedom of movement, I think in terms of the qualitative data so far, it's actually one of the areas in which I think that a mixture of these two themes was more evident. So people weren't so clearly distributed around the sort of moral to self-interest spectrum, if you will. And that, as I say, this became quite evident on this question. So even though for some, there were some sort of standalone arguments around ending freedom of movement, which was quite commonly supported across most people in the project and who participated in the research. That one of the core reasons for that is around fairness and equal treatment. So everybody should just have access to the same system. It's easier. It shouldn't matter where you're from, and everybody should have the same opportunity. But actually, what we saw more commonly in this discussion were that ethical and economic reasons were to some degree intertwined, as it was skills and not nationality that were thought to matter more to people when trying to come to decisions on this. And you can see this here in this quote, which I think quite well encapsulates some of what people were thinking. And popular to this approach, or popular in arguments and discussions around freedom of movement and the question of migration in general, rather than sticking to the system of freedom of movement, was instead swapping to an approach that would use selection criteria somehow to ensure migration inflows met Britain's needs. So this was correlated to the idea about kind of opening up and thinking about the ways in which Britain could have its needs met, whatever those needs might be, through a more open approach, but that somehow would have some degree of control and some degree of regulation, which we saw was increasingly favoured by people in the research. And the only other thing I wanted to point out around some of the sort of content and character of the discussion here is also the role of kind of evidence and affect. So what we found is that in lots of group discussions, mostly on the basis of the evidence that people were being asked to consider and the opportunity to discuss between themselves and with experts, is the opportunity to sort of develop or produce more nuance in the conversations and discussions they were having, because they were having to kind of produce and weigh information and swap arguments and reasoning. But also it really brought attention to both the practical and the more sort of human elements of immigration and the consequences therefore of some of the possible policy options under discussion. And so I picked out this quote really because I think it summarises quite a lot of both the contradictions that some people moved through whilst they were swapping between the spectrum, but ultimately a sense of idealism around we're all citizens of the world. We should all have the opportunity to do what we want and go where we want. And so whilst that was a sort of a utopian idea around how people wanted to see and be seen in terms of Britain, at the same time that they understood that had to square somehow with a more kind of practical viewpoint and the idea that regulation or rules and policies were needed in order to make sure that it was done in such a way that could meet, again, Britain's needs, which was the thing that came through most strongly. So two other reflections just in conclusion, on the basis of what I've whistled through here. But one is a note on perceptions and framing. And one of the things we found interesting about the data, regardless of the positions people were taking in terms of the arguments they were advancing, is that the tenor of discussions was notably different when migrants were being considered as potential workers than it was when they were being asked to evaluate policy options which positioned migrants as potential users of public services. And this wasn't something that we necessarily set up by way of any experiment in terms of the project. This is something that's kind of genuinely arisen through the analysis. So what you can see from the points here is that essentially the image of a migrant in participants' minds often appeared to shift depending on the topic being discussed, which we thought was an interesting finding, both in terms of how people were there for ultimately responding and advancing arguments, but also to think about in the future for research, for future research in this domain, when we're trying to explore and evaluate, if you like, what public attitudes might be in this space. So in kind of brief conclusion from some of the qualitative data that I've just gone through there, what we discovered is that our deliberations really have enabled Leavers and Remainers in the groups to explore their opinions. They were exposed to alternate points of view and helped to develop nuance on some of the key issues. Participants were also able to engage in civil discussion, and they had a real willingness to explore and consider the evidence of each other's views. So it made for, on the whole, really quite well-tempered discussions on something we weren't sure it would necessarily go like that when we set it up. And whilst two main considerations characterised discussions, these were sometimes contradictory. And as I said before, I think this, as well as the question of whether attitudes shifted and whether those shifts were durable over time, is something that John's going to have a look at now, and our survey data better shows how this played out, and ultimately whether we can identify any kind of crossing of the divide in terms of those who participated. So John, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ceri.
Thank you, Ceri. Just while we're switching over, can I ask people who are attending on Slido, if you've got questions, please do type them into the system. And you also have a scope to vote for questions that you like, which might help to choose priorities. Anyway, thanks very much, Ceri, and over to you, John.
Thanks very much. Before I jump into the data, let me just draw the threads together of where we're at so far. So Sara has very eloquently explained how we're looking at a world in the UK, at least, where there's a high degree of apparent affective polarization, and that in that respect, at least, the United Kingdom has elements of its political discourse and division that are also evident in the United States. Now, one of the key questions that are asked or is asked about deliberation and its impact is whether or not, as a result of deliberation, actually people do begin to develop common ground, or as we put it in the title for this presentation, there's a meeting of minds of people on the two sides, or alternatively, does it result in people moving further apart? They identify the arguments that are consistent with the things they've all previously believed, and they go and fall in behind those, and they reject those that are not Jim Fishkin, with whom we have been working on this project, and who is the original founder of deliberative polling as a research technique, actually published a paper. I think it may still be an early review, but with the APSR, the American Political Science Review, in which they reported the result of deliberative polling done before the 2020 US presidential election, in which they were interested in looking at the extent to which Republicans and Democrats, did they move further apart in the wake of deliberation, or did they move closer together? And what Ceri's already shown you is that certainly so far as the character of the deliberation is concerned, it would appear that it was characterized and conducted in a manner that might be thought to be conducive towards a meeting of minds, because people were both expressing nuanced views and were being expressed to contradictory views. So let's see what happened if we actually look at people's views as expressed in the surveys conducted just before they took part in deliberation, and again, literally before we kind of let them out of the Zoom call afterwards. So pre is people's views before deliberation, post is immediately afterwards. We'll come back later on to the question of the longevity of the impact. So the first of these, this is looking, first of all, at people's attitudes towards the consequences of immigration, and particularly looking at the economic impact. And we gave people a 0 to 10 scale, where 0 means people think it's bad for the economy, 10 thinks that it's good. And we simply divided these folk into 3 groups to make life simpler. What you will notice, first of all, actually, is that both groups moved slightly in a more favorable direction so far as their perceptions of the consequences of immigration are concerned, but that actually it's amongst leavers that this movement is most noticeable. And certainly, as you can see from the bottom, if we simply calculate the average score that people gave on this 0 to 10 scale, basically there isn't really any shift amongst Remainers. All of the shift occurs amongst leavers. So we're halfway there to a meeting of minds, in the sense that it's not clear that Remainers who were already very inclined to the view that immigration was economically beneficial for the UK, they weren't particularly moving towards leavers, but leavers were certainly moving fairly clearly in the direction of Remainers, although there is still clearly a division between them, even after a weekend of deliberation. We can do the same thing for people's perceptions of the cultural consequences of immigration. Here you can see, however you look at it, the attitudes of Remainers, which are largely favourable. They think that immigration enriches Britain's culture, was largely unchanged. But that in contrast, amongst Remainers, there is a clear shift in the direction of saying, well, actually, maybe Britain does benefit culturally from immigration after all. But again, as it were, it's a one-sided movement. So it's a partial meeting of minds. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, so what I'm now going to get is a whole series of slides that basically show that if you get people to deliberate, that deliberation proves to be something of a mechanism for inducing a greater liberal outlook. It's certainly a perception that I think some people have in the wake, for example, of how attitudes towards various moral issues, such as same-sex relationships and divorce, occurred in some citizens' assemblies in the Republic of Ireland. But perhaps, in our case at least, we are going to give the lie to the fact that deliberation necessarily makes people more liberal. So here we come to, in a sense, what is the most central question of immigration policy that is relevant to Brexit, which is whether or not we should maintain freedom of movement. Now, we don't use any of that jargon. We operate on the assumption that people don't understand the mumbo jumbo that comes out of Brussels. What we asked people was whether or not EU citizens who wish to come to Britain to work and live, and whether or not they should have to apply to do so or not, which is basically, obviously, the opposite of freedom of movement. You will see, first of all, that leavers were overwhelmingly of this view before deliberation, and they were just as clearly of this view after deliberation. They weren't really for shifting, but they were already strong in that direction. But you will see that amongst Remainers, who have previously been rather divided on the subject, shifted fairly clearly in favour of saying, actually, EU citizens should have to apply to join. So a crucial thing here is that actually, yes, we found movement, but the movement wasn't necessarily always in the same direction. And that the assumption that because people think that immigration might be beneficial, that they necessarily don't want immigration control, doesn't actually necessarily follow. But again, for our immediate interest here, certainly the two groups didn't diverge, but the meeting of minds is again a one-sided one, rather than the one that occurs with both groups moving towards each other. We asked lots of other more detailed questions, asking people about various aspects of immigration policy, such as whether or not there should be a minimum income limit that people should be earning before they're allowed to enter the UK. It's about 26k typically in the UK at the moment, and whether or not somebody who wishes to bring their spouse into the UK who's not a British citizen, whether they should have a minimum income, how quickly somebody should be eligible for benefits who comes to the UK, and also whether or not the spouse should have an adequate coverage of the English language. Now here, what you will notice that really, well, to some degree, you will see again some evidence of it's principally Remainers shifting in the direction of being less liberal. So on whether or not there should somebody should have a minimum income before they can bring in their non-UK spouse. It's Remainers primarily that shift, and the same is true on welfare. Though in other respects as to whether or not there should be a minimum income limit for migrants in general, it's really both sides that are moving. So insofar again as they come together, it's not the two groups coming together, but rather the group that was more liberal being more inclined to become less liberal, and the meeting of minds therefore here is of Remainers moving closer to Leavers, whereas on the general issue of the benefits of immigration, it was Leavers moving towards Remainers. So it's more nuanced than, in a sense, either side in the debate about the impact of deliberation are inclined to believe. Now, one of the things that we've done on this project, which is not always done in exercises on deliberation, is to ask the question, well, but hang on, what happens? How far does this impact of deliberation? Is it still in evidence if you go away and survey people again 3 or 4 months after the deliberation? I think this is an important issue, not only for deliberative polling, but also for citizens' assemblies as a technique. Is what you're capturing from a citizen assembly simply a mood in a particular moment, as opposed to an indication of a permanently created set of views? So what I'm now showing you here is again people's pre-deliberation view. Later is their view some months after the deliberation. Where it says Leavers post, it should say Leavers later. Now, this is looking at people's attitudes towards the cultural consequences of immigration. And as you can see, that movement amongst Leavers in the immediate wake of the deliberation doesn't actually really survive re-entry into the real world, as opposed to the rarefied world of online deliberation in a Zoom call. On the other hand, when it comes to the question of whether or not European Union citizens should be required to apply, then here what we discover is that, yes, some of the movement that occurred amongst Remainers, all the way, by the way, we're referring to the identity, not how people voted in 2016, their current identity. The shift amongst Remainers in less liberal direction, it's still in evidence. It's not as strong as it was immediately after the deliberation, but to some extent, at least, that impact of deliberation is there. So to that extent, at least, the movement in a more favorable direction amongst Leavers, as far as perceptions of immigration are concerned, doesn't survive 3 or 4 months later, but the impact of deliberation on the question of freedom of movement amongst Remainers does, at least to some degree, remain in evidence. So in a sense, the message from this research is that relatively simplistic assumptions that perhaps people might have about the impact of deliberation on people's attitudes are not necessarily going to be affirmed by the actual practice of deliberation. We have found, in a sense, what you might regard as contradictory movements, but we've also found that it was Remainers who sometimes shifted in a less liberal direction on the details of immigration policy, while Leavers moved in a more favorable direction on the consequences of immigration, but without in either case this being related to their views about the consequences. Meeting of minds to a degree, but it's a one-sided meeting of minds with respect to both of these movements, and to that extent at least, certainly we've not got evidence that suggests that people diverge despite the effective polarization in the real world from which these people have been extracted. But on the other hand, the meeting of minds is one that really is people of one side in the debate moving closer to the other, rather than the two sides coming closer together.
Thanks very much, John. That was fascinating. I wonder if I could ask you and Ceri about these questions of contradictory movements. and I wonder if one of the things you're hinting at, I had a bit of a sense from what Ceri was saying that it might be, is that people are holding contradictory views. And if they are, to what extent do you think they're working through those contradictions or aware of them? Or are the contradictions, as it were, contradictory from the point of view of an academic analyst observing and analysing them?
Do you want to have a go at that, Ceri?
I'll go first, yeah. So I think that there's something in the setup around deliberative polling where the kind of commitment to impartiality and the pros and cons of each option that people are invited to look at does trend people towards doing just that. So even with kind of predisposed views, then the opportunity and the invitation to talk about both what they might be in favour of, but also what they might imagine might happen if someone disagreed with them, as part of the process of deliberation, I think can account to some degree for the fact that there were some inherent contradictions, because in the discussions themselves, people weren't asked to find consensus. There are other forms of deliberation in which consensus is an important part of the process, but not in deliberative polling. It is the surveys pre and post, which are the places which you capture public attitudes. So I think that might account for it to a degree. I also think it might be partly a product of what John's just reflected in terms of the opportunity for some opinion shift, but not sort of mutual opinion shift. So whilst some people might be able to both see a counter argument or consider it in relation to their current view on a particular topic, it did seem from an analytical point of view that there was still some sort of internal conflicts which are unresolved, like this idea that people could get behind generally around wanting Britain to be an open, welcoming place, but at the same time really having appetite for regulation, which would demand some kind of practical arrangements which do put limits on things. So I think that it's probably a mixture of those two things which I would say account for some of what we found. And I do think, again, as with all research, the question you're asking is the thing that will drive what you can expect to find. So the work that John was referencing that Jim has recently done and has reported on in their latest journal article, some of the questions they were asking of Republicans and Democrats were really big, philosophical questions about how you want the world to be. And I wonder how that acts in terms of the ability to more clearly delineate shifts and get rid of contradictions in the abstract then when asking about specific questions of policy and the detail that is correlated with that. So, yeah.
I mean, the only additional reflection I will add to this is, I think, standing back more broadly from what we've been finding in our research from what we've presented now, and also thinking about lots of other research in the same area. I think essentially, what we now know about attitudes towards immigration in the UK is that, one, people are inclined to believe that it can be beneficial, but and that indeed, much in general, the public have become much more attuned to the potential benefits of immigration, but at the same time, they want it to be controlled, and to be controlled so that it serves the country's self-interest. And that's one of the themes that Ceri was talking about that comes out quite clearly. And to that extent, at least, I think we've certainly formed the view that, therefore, to some degree, the UK government has misunderstood what the public are looking for in the way of immigration policy. So they're not necessarily looking for a big cap on numbers. They are looking for a sense that it's under control, and they are looking for a sense that it should be promoted or should be utilized to promote the country's self-interest. And that actually one of the things that came out of the discussion, it wasn't an issue that we were particularly priming them on, was, believe it or not, that people were saying, well, of course, one of the things that we should do, because we did ask people about what occupations should be prioritized. And it's very clear that people's views about what occupations should be prioritized do not map on the views that the UK government have. It's not to do with skill. It's to do with the social worth of the occupations, one. And two, in the discussion, what people are saying, well, of course, what we should do is to admit those occupations that we're short of. And that, in other words, actually, it's almost undoubtedly the case that the UK government has much more freedom of movement at the moment to adjust immigration policy to meet the way in which coronavirus has created a labour market shortage in the UK, then perhaps it realises that actually people actually would, and that they could have moved much more quickly on lorry drivers. And also, by the way, there's no reason why they should stop care workers coming into the UK. Care workers are amongst the occupations that people think are a high priority for admission, but there are other skilled groups like bankers. No, don't want any more bankers, thank you very much. So it doesn't align, people's views about whom should be admitted don't align to skill, they don't align to income, they align to this country's self-interest and the social worth of the occupation. So there is quite considerable room for rewriting current immigration policy in a way that's still consistent with the original Brexit mandate, but would actually, I think, be much more closely attuned to A, what the public are seeking, and B, also would give the government much more flexibility, given that, I mean, one of the ironies of this situation is that, Brexit was designed to solve a problem that disappeared. I mean, high levels of immigration is not the problem that the UK is suffering from at the moment. All of a sudden, we have discovered that thanks to coronavirus, we have a labour market shortage. And the world has moved on, and actually I think there is room within UK public opinion to move immigration policy in line with the circumstances that we now face, which are not the ones that were envisaged when the UK government originally designed its post-Brexit immigration policy.
Thanks, John. I'm going to go to some of the questions on the slide. Oh, Sara, did you want to come in?
Well, I just wanted to a brief question relating to that, because what John just said there is, I think, very interesting, and also in line with some of the survey work James and I have done on actually preferences in immigration post-Brexit. But I was wondering in terms of the role that identity plays in your deliberative polling, because I was thinking some of the first questions maybe, well, in a sense, you say, oh, we're not going to use the EU mumbo jumbo of freedom of movement. But I'm wondering, like, if you had done, then maybe Remainers would have been more, well, that's part of what I am. I'm a Remainer, I believe in freedom of movement, because even if people might not understand the detail of it, they understand that that's sort of part of the EU package because of how. So again, I know you didn't do probably experimental work on this. I'm just sort of, by making it kind of very technical, you have to apply, it might have been easier, might have made it easier for people to think, oh yeah, we like immigrants, but of course they should apply. So I'm sort of, in terms of sort of understanding the role that identity plays in deliberative polling by linking certain policies more closely to a Remain or Leave identity, or not, as I think you, in a sense, you've moved away from it. Might it make it easier or harder for people then to move?
Well, I mean, the answer to Sarah is that we weren't particularly interested at priming identity. We were primarily interested at ascertaining what a relatively well-informed representative sample of the electorate, what kind of post-Brexit policies they wanted in the wake of deliberation and what impact did deliberation have. And so we were primarily interested in, and the project is very, I mean, the way the project is set up is that people were given a whole set of policy options, and in each case they were given the arguments for doing one and for doing the other. All right, and that's the way it's set up, and they're being asked to work through these because, in a sense, we're inviting them to be policymakers. So that's the objective: is to find out, as it were, what they think policy should be. So, to that extent, at least, we are. I mean, of course, the words freedom of movement passed the lips during the deliberation because it was being explained what the current position was and why we might still want to give EU citizens, the right to come here. But in terms of coming up with survey questions, sorry, but as a survey researcher, don't ask questions about things that people don't necessarily understand. And certainly, given the aims of our project, we were interested in priming people's identity with boo and hurrah words.
Thanks. So we have a question from Titus Alexander, about how political parties can get people to look beyond Brexit identities, Leaver, Remainer identities, to engage with issues based on evidence of impact and material interest. I don't know if this is someone who's trying to run a political party campaign or something, but does anyone want to take that?
Well, I mean, look, the honest truth is that even with the relatively weak partisan identities that we have so far as parties are concerned these days, look, it's just a part of human nature that we tend to view the world, we are inclined to view the world in such a way that we're inclined to interpret evidence in such a way that we make them consistent with our existing views. And it's only if we get really discombobulated that we end up changing our minds. I mean, that's just basic human psychology. And it's just that where we formed a very strong sense of identity with a particular partisan point of view, then obviously these people are particularly reluctant to move. But this goes on all the time in our politics. I mean, just do an evaluation of it. Ask people at any point in time how well or badly the economy is doing. You will always get a different distribution of answers from Conservative voters and Labour voters, even now. So sorry, it's impossible, right? Basically, people always have their view, but that doesn't mean to say you can't change people's minds. The point is, you just have to realise that you're engaged in the difficult effort of trying to change people's minds.
Did you want to come in on this, James?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, I think one of the slides that Sara showed earlier was about the way in which the different parties now have a more aligned with Brexit identity in general. But it's worth thinking about why that's happened, because one reason that's happened is because people who were Remainers, who say supported the Conservatives, have left and now support another party. But a lot of why that's happened is actually people who are Remainers now say they're neither. They've lost their Brexit identity because it doesn't match their party identity as the parties have realigned around it. And so, as John was saying, people interpret the world through the lens of their different social identities, and in Britain at least, the way in which that realignment of the party identity and Brexit identity has happened means that people have had to do that in order to bring these things into line and make sense of the world in various ways.
Yeah, and what's also true, James, is that on the Conservative side, at least, they deliberately mobilised their identities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and I guess that's quite important as well. The extent to which the parties have identified themselves with that cause, and I think it is really interesting to see how many Leavers there were who were Liberal Democrats in 2017 still.
Sure.
There now aren't any, and that's because of what the Liberal Democrats chose to do as a party to some extent, just the same as what the Conservatives chose to do as a party.
But equally also, it's one of the fascinating puzzles of our time, is that although the Leave identity is still being mobilised by the Conservatives, but neither the Labour nor the Liberal Democrats are currently trying to mobilise the Remain identity, but they're still stuck with it anyway. They cannot get rid of the legacy of 2019 that they would love to get rid of. They're still stuck with it, and they're still neither of them comfortable with it, and neither of them really knows how the hell to respond to the situation.
So I've got a question from John Denham here about important substantive issues for Leave voters being immigration and national sovereignty. To what extent do Leavers now feel their aspirations on these two issues have been delivered, whatever their views on the wider impact of Brexit? So Sara, James?
Well, a more general in terms of how has it been delivered. I mean, what you generally see if you follow sort of Remainers on Twitter and stuff, they're saying, oh, well, surely now the Leavers must have realized that nothing has been delivered. But if you remember the slide I showed in terms of the effect, so that's a much more general thing, but what has been the effect of Brexit on the country? You will see a very stable and fairly high level of optimism amongst leavers. So does it mean that every leaver feels that everything has been delivered? And of course, there's a lot of heterogeneity in why people might have voted leave. But the optimism certainly on average is there, and it hasn't changed. So there hasn't been a kind of massive change in mood that people now are very unhappy and think that Brexit is a cause for pessimism. What we do see is it's not that public opinion doesn't change. If you look at things like government's handling on Brexit, which is one of the other things that James and I've looked at over time, that changes massively over time. So there have been times where even leavers have thought, no, the government is doing a terrible job of this. So it's not that leavers cannot be critical, for example, of government, but I don't think that this sort of the base level of optimism has gone away. And some of that has to do with the sort of the cognitive dissonance that people like to avoid that John talked about, you know, and some of it has to do with when leavers look at the world, they are happy about what Brexit has done, whereas Remainers look at it and they're unhappy. And so that's exactly that fundamental different way of processing, you know, some of the same information, whereas therefore Remainers think, why can they not see? And equally leavers will think it the same of Remainers. So that has not shifted over time. So in that sense, there's not been a sort of a reckoning or a regret, as some people like to say it, amongst leavers. That's not what we find in our data.
No, and I think it depends a little bit. You know, your question, Dan, was focused there on delivered in terms of national sovereignty, and you know, that might be the issue that was more motivating people on the Leave side. And you know, that has been delivered because Britain has left the EU. I mean, bluntly. Whereas if you maybe on the Remain side, perhaps a more motivating issue might have been, say, some kind of economic consequences, which may or may not have happened, but you certainly will perceive that they've happened and they've been bad. So I think it's not just about interpreting the world, it's also about having different priorities for what you want to start with. And you know, I would say probably if you're on the Leave side, then you can see one very important fact has happened. Britain's left the EU, and if that's what you care about, then you're going to be relatively happy about that.
I would just add a little bit of nuance to that. I don't fundamentally disagree. I think certainly all the data that I've seen, including data I've collected, suggests that the pessimism stroke antagonism of Remainers is stronger than the optimism stroke applause of Leavers. And that also, I think there's also some evidence there that, and this is almost inevitable if you implement any public policy. On the Remain side, it's very easy for all of them to say it's rubbish. And so they all agree it's rubbish, right? In contrast, on the Leave side, the government has had to deliver Brexit. And inevitably in delivering Brexit, they have come up with an outcome that is not necessarily in line with what those who voted for it necessarily wanted. And I think there is certainly some evidence there that for some Leave voters, the David Frost view of Brexit is rather too tough. But equally also, there are still other Leave voters out there who are going, and it's not tough enough. And you know, the rows about migrants to the Channel will help to reinforce that view. So in a sense, therefore, you know, it's always more difficult when you implement a public policy that you are at risk of not only being criticized by those who were opposed to the principle in the first place, but you also get criticism for the implementation for those who are on your side of the argument. So that's worth bearing in mind. The only thing I think we should also bear in mind, I mean, although I do constantly keep on saying, you know, this country is just divided down the middle on Brexit, and it is, it does look to be the case in the last 3 or 4 months that the support for being outside the European Union has shaved away, but it's actually gone in cycles since January 2020. So as soon as we got out, there was a mood of, right, we're out, that's it, and it's all over. And then as people got nervous about the outcome of the trade negotiations, opinions started to swing back to, I'm not quite sure about this after all. And then when the trade negotiation was finally achieved on Christmas Eve last year, there was a sigh of relief and people said, okay, Brexit's over, it's all done. And now in the last 3 or 4 months, we've gone back again, where even when people are being asked about stay out versus rejoin, you're getting small majorities in favor of rejoin. So there's a certain amount of movement there, but it is around a very, very evenly divided position. And with, I mean, certainly what isn't true is, a lot of people still articulate is that Remain voters have given up the ghost. It's all over. They don't care. They accept that Brexit is done. That is a fundamental misconception about where we are at.
Thanks, John. Ceri?
Just very briefly wanted to add on to that around the idea of kind of leaver expectations. And it just made me think of some other work that UKIS commissioned around comfortable leavers, so research that we did in the last 18 months or so. And one of the findings from that research was that whilst we were talking to a particular demographic of leavers, those who were relatively wealthy compared to the areas that they lived in the UK, I think it was a matter of time scale. People were prepared to wait longer in order to achieve the expectations, or the things that they were expecting from Brexit. So that became something quite obvious. So though people were expecting short-term issues around the economy, for example, or some lack of clarity around trade, it was a trade-off they were prepared to make in anticipation of deriving benefits around the economy and around sovereignty, for example. So I think that is another kind of aspect that just made me think of in terms of people. Yeah, there's a temporal aspect to whether people's expectations have been met a lot, and perhaps leavers are prepared to wait a little longer.
Thanks, Ceri. I've got another question that I'd like to pose to you, if that's all right. I think we've dealt fairly comprehensively with the questions about sort of stability of Brexit attitudes and identities, and what, if any, element of regret there is. But one of the questions that's come in picks up your discussion of kind of the instrumental or self-interested motivations as against ethical motivations. And across the presentation, the emphasis seemed to be on kind of a move in a more liberal direction on the overarching issue, but in a less liberal dimension on all the individual points, and so a prioritizing of kind of the needs of people living in Britain in the immigration system. The question throws another angle on that, which is whether you picked up any different considerations in relation to quote unquote genuine refugees fleeing war and persecution who need our help, and migrants whose primary motivation is a better life, and might therefore be expected to make an economic contribution. So that picks up the moral question, but puts it in a slightly different way, and identifies a group that might be considered sort of particularly deserving, as it were. Is that anything that came through in the research?
Unfortunately, it's not something we've got a lot of data on. People generally tended to stick to the script, actually, in terms of the things that they were being asked to discuss, which was a surprise to us all. I think that it definitely did occur in some discussions. We have very few examples, but it's exactly as you predicted, Dan. So where there was talk around kind of refugees or migration related to a more sort of, for more related reasons, I think that generally the tenor of those discussions was around, well, that's both a separate consideration, so somehow other people didn't link that in the same way to questions of what they might perceive to be forms of economic or kind of cultural migration, and yes, a sort of more deserving, and therefore we should consider differently, and it should be understood in a different way. But it didn't go any further than that, so we don't have anything specific on that.
Yeah, we weren't covering refugee policy towards refugees, Dan. It was about, as it were, regular immigration, as opposed to the crisis immigration that might be created by a refugee situation.
Thank you. One for Sara or James in the first instance, and it's about the relationship between Brexit identities and political mobilization around COVID. So asking about anti-vaxxers, COVID deniers, lockdown protesters. Is there any association with the Leave or Remain identity divide there?
I can say something first. Maybe I did another paper note with James, although I much prefer working with James on willingness to wear masks, which of course in the US has been something that's been very politicized, and so therefore we were interested in seeing are there similar, both in terms of how you received the messages from different types of elites, but also in terms of just your baseline willingness. And one thing that's fascinating and interesting, and I think a very good thing about the UK is I think people very much came together around the COVID crisis in a way we haven't seen it in the US. So I think the overarching message is one of people who generally responded in very similar way to the kind of guidance that they received from the government and were generally supportive. That's not that we don't see differences in the margins, but we do not have the level of polarization along partisan or along Brexit identities that we've seen in the US. So I just think that's the sort of the baseline message. We did see that that whereas there's no significant difference, there was, you know, Leavers are slightly less willing to wear masks than Remainers. So we did find a difference there, but just to say it's not at the sort of level of difference you have between Republicans and Democrats. And they were also, interestingly, when we cued them with public health messages, slightly less responsive to public health messages than Remainers. James?
I've got a question for you, Sara, on that. Does that hold constant people's age? Because that's a very strong predictor of whether you want to engage in precautions and things, unsurprisingly.
Yeah, it's also controlling for age. But again, I think the differences are really quite, you know, I don't want to sort of overplay it, because again, when we compare to the sort of partisan differences and divides we've seen in the US, and also I think sometimes because that some of the people who've been most vocal in terms of being anti-lockdown and so on have often maybe been also coincided with being Leavers or sort of prominent Brexiteers. But that doesn't mean that the sort of average Leaver is not very compliant and with the government guidance and things. So I think we shouldn't confuse the two things. And I think actually that COVID was a moment in also interestingly across Labour and Conservatives, where Labour supporters were just as likely to listen to the government, if actually slightly more in our research than Conservative supporters. So it's just not been a very, unlike Brexit, it's not been a very polarizing issue, but to the extent that there are small differences, it is that Leavers are slightly more reluctant to be in favor of sort of more lockdown, more social distancing and so on.
So did you do that before or after the opening up in England?
Well, so we did that over summer 2020. So it was opening up. So not in this very recent way.
Oh yeah, so it's not. It's
September.
Yes, so I mean, I wonder if you would.
There might be bigger differences now.
Bigger differences now.
I think that's probably right. But we didn't do it in the sort of height of the sort of full lockdown where no one left their house. But
it's since the easing of the measures in England that some of the divisions, political divisions, have come up.
And that might well be the case. Yes, this is not unlike this sort of work that James and I, this is not a kind of regular tracker. But I just thought it's just fascinating how this sort of very, very stark partisan division. And we came out, of course, a period, like James rightly said, where we were very polarized as a nation, and as polarized in many ways and I think that also speaks to our political leaders here, that they came together and delivered much more unified messages across the political spectrum than what we saw in the US, and I think people have responded accordingly.
That's fascinating, particularly coming out of that period of really extreme polarization. Although I do wonder, and I'll look at John here, whether there are differences across the nations in the UK there. I mean, certainly living in Wales, it did feel as if there was a strong tension between the messaging from the government, the devolved government here and the UK government, and very often UK government messaging was unclear or seemed unclear about whether it applied to the whole of the UK, the whole of Britain, or just to England. Do you have any of it on that?
Well, yeah, we're getting into really dangerous territory now. Sure. I mean, particularly since the easing of restrictions, you know, the honest truth is that social life in England and social life in Scotland are now completely different from each other. And you're now seeing this. So, of course, in England now, you're having a certain amount of trouble in getting people to wear masks because they got out of the habit. Because we've never dropped the habit in Scotland. I mean, you do not see people not wearing a mask in a supermarket and relatively rarely on public transport. It's just become part of the everyday fabric. And to that extent, at least, yeah. So that's point one. Point two is, you know, it happens to be true that Boris Johnson was the wrong prime minister for a public health crisis, and Nicola Sturgeon happened to be, and indeed Mark Drakeford happened to be much more better. And you see the problem. I mean, you see the problem the government has got into in the last week about whether or not you should go to a party or not. I mean, the UK government has constantly been at sixes and sevens about some of its public health measures, essentially, of course, because, and this is the crucial difference between England and the devolved territories, is because the government is trying to keep on board a body of backbenchers who happen to be the most skeptical about COVID measures. Neither Mark Drakeford nor Nicola Sturgeon have to worry about their own backbenchers. The opposition, if it exists, comes from the opposition. And therefore, as a result, they don't have any difficulty in saying to people, wear masks, et cetera, and they've never been under any pressure to drop it in the first place. And that certainly then, of course, as you might imagine, potentially plays into the whole argument about independence up here. But I think at that point I'll stop.
Yeah, that was a nice detour into dangerous territory there, John. We have a question which I will probably aim at Sara and James in the first instance, but anyone who's got evidence on it can jump in. It's whether we know if young people who reached voting age since 2016 share in the Remain or Leaver identities to the same extent as older people. Is it older people, say over 50, who are more likely to have very strong, stable, rigid feelings about belonging to Leave and Remain identities? And I guess you could frame that as a question about whether there's a generational dimension to the strength of these identities more broadly, rather than just people who are rising voting age.
Do you want me to answer this one, Sara? Okay. So this is maybe slightly impressionistic, but I would say that there isn't a huge amount of difference in strength by age or generation. There may be a little bit, but there isn't very much. The real difference is between people who voted in the referendum and people who either didn't vote or were unable to vote because they weren't old enough. And so I think we would see these identities as prompted by the act of voting in the referendum, acquiring that label, and then being amongst the argy-bargy of the debate and being on one side or the other. If you didn't actually participate, either because you weren't bothered or you weren't able to, then you never really entered that. So if we just look at people who voted in the referendum, then we have, I think it's still about 3/4 of people who voted in the referendum still have a Remain or Leave identity, whereas if you look at the whole population, it's quite a bit below that, and it's gone down quite a bit faster. And partially that's because over the last few years since the referendum happened, some people have entered the electorate who were unable to vote, and they typically, although if you ask them how they might vote, those people who are in their early 20s would very likely, if they were able to vote in the referendum in the past, have voted to Remain. They don't normally have an identity, and if they do, it's very weakly held. Because they didn't have a catalyst of the actual moment in the polling booth where you had to tick or put the cross next to one box or the other. I think that answers your question, I hope.
Yeah, it does. So the moment of voting was a kind of crucible moment when new identities were forged.
I think that's right. In that sense, it's quite different to how we might think about party identities, which we typically think of as, you're socialized into them almost as a child or adolescent within the family. And you often, most people tend to have the same party identity as their parents, at least in relatively stable party systems. And so it's not quite like that because, you didn't learn to be a Remainer on your mother's knee. It didn't exist until until the question was decided by the Electoral Commission. Could have been a different question. We'd be calling people different labels. So it was created by that moment, and therefore, if you didn't participate in the moment, you're less attached to these kind of social identities.
Thanks. So we have another question from Vernon Bogdaner, who says, research shows that the majority of social scientists are liberals, is there such a thing as liberal bias in the workings of deliberative democracy? I mean, I guess we could specify that in relation to deliberative polling, which is the methodology we've been talking about today. John?
I think the answer to that is clear, and in a sense, I have to admit that it's one of the things I think makes our research interesting, is that we did not move people in a more liberal direction. We actually moved them in a less liberal direction. And to that extent, at least, I don't think it is necessarily biased. I mean, and we were very, very careful to come up with both impartial written materials and balanced plenaries. So to give you an idea on both on our advisory group who looked at our materials, as well as in the plenary session, well, first of all, we had Madeleine Sumption from the Migration Observatory, who is probably the best person in the UK if you want somebody just to give it to you straight without any indication as to whether it's a good or a bad thing. But then equally, we had Sundar Katwala from British Future, and we had somebody varied on 2 occasions from Migration Watch. Right, so people were exposed to both sides of the argument, both in the written material and in the plenary discussion. And the fact that in the end, I mean, I went into this, sharing some of Vernon's concern about, and particularly because of the way in which, I mean, it's certainly true. I think there's a section of liberal opinion that have given up on referendums, who, even though they thought they were a brilliant idea until the EU referendum, and have now embraced deliberation as the way to get sensible answers out of the public. Well, I think one of the kind of subtext of our research is that don't necessarily assume that deliberation will end up producing a liberal answer, and certainly in our case it didn't.
That's fascinating. So do you have methodological advice for other people looking to undertake this kind of research?
Well, I mean, we were following deliberately following a methodology that Jim had developed and been used elsewhere, and I've been involved in similar exercises, 20 years ago. The only thing one can say with all of this is that if you want to, well, the other thing I would say is this, and again, this was partly serendipity. Originally, what we were going to do was we were going to do it online, then we were going to do it face to face. Well, we ended up having to do it online twice. But one of the advantages of that has been that basically we've also been able to address one of the other issues about deliberation that are not normally addressed, which is whether the results are reliable or not, i.e. do you get the same answer if you do the same exercise twice? Now, I've just shown you the results for the 2 exercises combined, but actually, if you look at them separately, we also got the same pattern of movement in the 2 exercises separately. So, so far as retest reliability is concerned, it also seems to work. So, I mean, if you want to improve the quality of deliberative research, I would say retest reliability is a crucial issue. I'm looking at the long-term effects is crucial, and we're being entirely open about that. I think on our basis, retest reliability works. Long-term effects, potentially much more problematic, but that certainly by just simply doing your level best on whatever you're doing to make sure that you have got written materials that present both sides of the argument, that you can find people like Madeleine who can play it straight and will say, well, this is the advantage of doing this, and this is the disadvantage, and vice versa. And without wanting to push in another direction, then to get some advocates, which again, and indeed, I mean, one of the fascinating things, I mean, which kind of, in a sense, I think both Ceri and I were surprised, it's not only that we didn't get flaming in the discussion between participants. Actually, the fascinating thing about the plenary speakers was they usually agreed about the facts. There was very little disagreement from our speakers about the facts. The disagreement was about what you did and what we should do given those facts. And of course, British Future and Migration Watch drew different implications from the evidence that was before them, which I guess in a sense takes us back to our earlier discussion, how even if people agree about the facts, their prior partisan views will mean that the way in which they interpret those facts and the implications they draw from them will not necessarily be the same. But given we were talking about all three of them were people who were highly expert in the area, they knew the territory, they largely agreed about where we were at. They just disagreed. At the end, Sunda wants a world in which we've got diversity, and migration wants a world in which we don't have too many migrants. And there was nothing at the end of the day that was going to marry those two, even though they agree as to what's been happening up to now.
Thanks very much. This is the second in a series of Research Insights events that we've been running through UK and Changing Europe. It's a more kind of research-focused version of the kinds of events that we usually run. So I'm very keen to encourage people participating to fill in the survey so we can make these as good as we can. And having encouraged you to do that, I just want to give each of our panelists a chance for a final word, maybe starting with James.
I don't think I have a final word, I'm afraid, Dan, but Sara might have something more intelligent.
Do you want to take it, Sara?
Well, I mean, first of all, of course, to thank you, but also to thank really the UK and Changing Europe for allowing us to do, I think what we are showing in both of these projects is that researchers can do sort of real-time almost research on issues that are both, defining of our time in a way, and still do certainly for John and Ceri sort of quite innovative, methodologically innovative research, but on something that are big issues that we are grappling right now as a country. And I think that's fascinating. I love to share this panel today with them and see what they're doing, but also to thank you in the UK and Changing Europe for allowing us to do that. That's been a wonderful experience to be able to research something that is also, the big issues of the day right now. And that's one of the key challenges, I think, for social scientists to do that, but also at the same time trying to do it rigorously in the way that we do as social scientists. So that will be my final word.
John?
Well, Sarah's been very nice about us, so let me repay the compliment. I think there is no doubt that Sara and James have done some absolutely crucial work in bringing to our attention the importance of identity, because of course, Brexit identity, because the really fascinating thing about it is, in a sense, it raises questions about 30 years worth of political science research. For 30 years, we've been saying that identity has declined, and a more educated electorate is going to be increasingly rational, and they're concerned about which is the most competent political party, and that politics is now entirely and utterly about valence issues. Well, the last 5 years have well and truly shown the lie to that, and that we do have this fascinating situation where, James pointed out earlier, all of a sudden, the identities we thought we had lost in the 1970s have reappeared in very strong form, but in a different way, and acquired in a very different way. And it does just remind us that we think that we think as social scientists, we've identified long-term social change, which is resulting in long-term political change, only for politics to have the nasty habit of upending all of our assumptions and putting us back in a world that we last experienced 50 years ago.
Thanks. And Ceri, do you want to follow that?
Yes, I will follow it with a slight bias towards deliberation and deliberative methods, big shocker. But I think, having kind of listened to what panelists have shared today and reflecting on some of the questions, I think my final word is really just around some of the potential, I think, that's kind of being demonstrated by our project about the role deliberation might have to play, not solely in a sort of broad deliberative democracy or more deliberative democratic principles, but in research, in policy making, not just necessarily as a mechanism for trying to achieve what we might perceive to be more liberal outcomes, but actually more as a mechanism for trying to support talk across difference. And especially with this kind of reconstitution of social identities, which Sara and James have been talking about. I'm curious about the intersection between deliberation and some of its potential, not necessarily always as we're showing for solely sort of more liberal outcomes, but what it means to be able to talk across difference and how that might be a useful tool in both research policy making and kind of broader questions of sort of everyday problems and lives. And so, yeah, I'm hoping to continue on those thoughts, and this discussion has really helped to spark off some further inspiration there. So thank you.
Thanks, Ceri. Well, I'd also just like to thank the four of you. It's a rare and unusual privilege to be able to work through the Governance After Brexit programme in UK and Changing Europe with researchers and research that's as exciting and innovative as that, and kind of interesting for me to hear about these deep effective polarizations and yet the ability to carry through effective deliberative polling research after a period of really intense political division, polarization and conflict. So I just want to thank the four of you for really fascinating presentations this afternoon.